This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 21. The Half-Sisters. It appeared as if Mrs. Gibson's predictions were likely to be verified, for Osborne Hamley found his way to her drawing-room pretty frequently. To be sure, sometimes prophets can help on the fulfilment of their own prophecies, and Mrs. Gibson was not passive. Molly was altogether puzzled by his manners and ways. He spoke of occasional absences from the Hall, without exactly saying where he had been. But that was not her idea of the conduct of a married man, who, she imagined, ought to have a house and servants, and pay rent and taxes, and live with his wife. Who this mysterious wife might be, faded into insignificance before the wonder of where she was. London, Cambridge, Dover, nay, even France, were mentioned by him as places to which he had been on these different little journeys. The facts came out quite casually, almost as if he were unaware of what he was betraying. Sometimes he dropped out such sentences as these: "Ah, that would be the day I was crossing. It was stormy indeed. Instead of our being only 2 hours, we were nearly 5. Or, "I met Lord Hollingford at Dover last week, and he said," etc. "The cold now is nothing to what it was in London on Thursday. The thermometer was down at 15 degrees." Perhaps in the rapid flow of conversation these small revelations were noticed by no one but Molly, whose interest and curiosity were always hovering over the secret she had become possessed of, in spite of all her self-reproach for allowing her thoughts to dwell on what was still to be kept as a mystery. It was also evident to her that Osborne was not too happy at home. He had lost the slight touch of cynicism which he had been affected when he was expected to do wonders at college, and that was one good result of his failure. If he did not give himself the trouble of appreciating other people and their performances, at any rate his conversation was not so amply sprinkled with critical pepper. He was more absent, not so agreeable, Mrs. Gibson thought, but did not say. He looked ill in health, but that might be the consequence of the real depression of spirits which Molly occasionally saw peeping out through all his pleasant surface talk. Now and then he referred to the happy days that are gone, or to the time when my mother was alive, when talking directly to her, and then his voice sank, and a gloom came over his countenance, and Molly longed to express her own deep sympathy. He did not often mention his father, and Molly thought she could read in his manner when he did, that something of the painful restraint she had noticed when she was last at the Hall still existed between them. Nearly all that she knew of the family interior she had heard from Mrs. Hamley, and she was uncertain as to how far her father was acquainted with them, so she did not like to question him too closely. Nor was he a man to be so questioned as to the domestic affairs of his patients. Sometimes she wondered if it was a dream, that short half-hour in the library at Hamley Hall, when she had learnt a fact which seemed so all-important to Osborne, yet which made so little difference in his way of life, either in speech or action. During the 12 or 14 hours or so that she had remained at the Hall afterward, no further allusion had been made to his marriage, either by himself or by Roger. It was indeed very like a dream. Probably Molly would have been rendered so much more uncomfortable in the possession of her secret if Osborne had struck her as particularly attentive in his devotion to Cynthia. She evidently amused and attracted him, but not in any lively or passionate kind of manner. He admired her beauty, and seemed to feel her charm, but he would leave her side and come to sit near Molly if anything reminded him of his mother, about which he could talk to her, and to her alone. Yet he came so often to the Gibsons that Mrs. Gibson might be excused for the fancy she had taken into her head that it was for Cynthia's sake. He liked the lounge, the friendliness, the company of 2 intelligent girls of beauty and manner above the average, one of whom stood in a particular relation to him, as having been especially beloved by the mother whose memory he cherished so fondly. Knowing himself to be out of the category of bachelors, he was, perhaps, too indifferent as to other people's ignorance, and its possible consequences. Somehow Molly did not like to be the first to introduce Roger's name into the conversation, so she lost many an opportunity of hearing intelligence about him. Osborne was often so languid or so absent that he only followed the lead of the talk. and as an awkward fellow who had paid her no particular attention, and as a second son, Roger was not preeminent in Mrs. Gibson's thoughts. Cynthia had never seen him, and the freak did not take her so often to speak about him. He had not come home since he had obtained his high place in the mathematical lists, that Molly knew, and she knew too that he was working hard for something. She supposed a fellowship, and that was all. Osborne's tone in the speaking of him was always the same. Every word, every inflection of the voice breathed out affection and respect, nay, even admiration. And this from the nil admirari brother, who seldom carried his exertions so far. "Ah, Roger," he said one day. Molly caught the name in an instant, though she had not heard what had gone before. "He is a fellow in 1,000, in 1,000 indeed. I don't believe there is his match anywhere for goodness and real solid power combined." "Molly," said Cynthia, after Mr. Osborne Hamley had gone, "what sort of man is this Roger Hamley? One can't tell how much to believe of his brother's praises, for it is the one subject on which Osborne Hamley becomes enthusiastic. I've noticed it once or twice before." While Molly hesitated on which point of the large round to begin her description, Mrs. Gibson struck in. "It just shows what a sweet disposition Osborne Hamley is of, that he should praise his brother as he does. I dare say he is senior wrangler, and much good may it do for him. I don't deny that. But as for conversation, he's as heavy can be. A great awkward fellow to boot, who looks as if he did not know 2 and 2 made 4, for all he is such a mathematical genius. You would hardly believe he was Osborne Hamley's brother to see him. I should not think he had a profile at all." "What do you think of him, Molly?" said the persevering Cynthia. "I like him," said Molly. "He has been very kind to me. I know he isn't handsome like Osborne." It was rather difficult to say all this quietly, but Molly managed to do it, quite aware that Cynthia would not rest till she had extracted some kind of opinion out of her. "I suppose he will come home at Easter," said Cynthia, "and then I shall see him for myself." "It's a great pity that their being in mourning will prevent them going to the Easter charity ball," said Mrs. Gibson plaintively. "I shan't like to take you 2 girls, if you are not to have any partners. It will put me in such an awkward position. I wish we could join on to the Towers party. That would secure you partners, for they always bring a number of dancing men, who might dance with you after they have done their duty by the ladies of the house. But really everything is so changed since dear Lady Cumnor has been an invalid, that perhaps they won't go at all." This Easter ball was a great subject of conversation with Mrs. Gibson. She sometimes spoke of it as her first appearance in society as a bride, though she had been visiting once or twice a week all winter long. Then she shifted her ground, and said she felt so much interest in it, because she would have the responsibility of introducing both her own and Mr. Gibson's daughter to public notice, though the fact was, that pretty nearly every one who was going to this ball had seen the 2 young ladies, though not their ball dresses, before. But aping the manners of the aristocracy as far as she knew them, she intended to bring out Molly and Cynthia on this occasion, which she regarded in something of the light as a presentation at court. "They are not out yet," was her favourite excuse when either of them was invited to any house to which she did not wish them to go, or invited without her. She even made a difficulty of their not being out when Miss Browning, that old friend of the Gibson family, came in one morning to ask the 2 girls to come to a very friendly tea and a round game afterward. This mild piece of gaiety being designed as an attention to 3 of Mr. Goodenough's grandchildren, 2 young ladies and their schoolboy brother, who were staying on a visit to their grandmamma. "You are very kind, Miss Browning, but you see I hardly like to let them go. They are not out, you know, till after the Easter ball." "Till then we are invisible," said Cynthia, always ready with her mockery to exaggerate any pretension of her mother's. "We are so high in rank that our sovereign must give us her sanction before we can play a round game at your house." Cynthia enjoyed the idea of her own full-grown size and stately nature, as contrasted with that of a meek half-fledged girl in the nursery, but Miss Browning was half puzzled and half affronted. "I don't understand it at all. In my days girls went wherever it pleased people to ask them, without this farce of bursting out in all their new fine clothes at some public place. I don't mean but what the gentry took their daughters to York or Matlock or Bath to give them a taste of gay society when they were growing up, and the quality went up to London, and their young ladies were presented to Queen Charlotte, and went to a birthday ball perhaps. But for us little Hollingford people, why, we knew every child amongst us from the day of its birth, and many a girl of 12 or 14 have I seen go to a card party, and sit quiet at her work, and know how to behave as well as any lady there. There was no talk of coming out in those days for any one under the daughter of a squire. After Easter, Molly and I shall know how to behave at a card party, but not before," said Cynthia demurely. "You're always fond of your quips and cranks, my dear," said Miss Browning, "and I wouldn't quite answer for your behaviour. You sometimes let your spirits carry you away. But I'm quite sure Molly will be a little lady as she always is, and always was, and I have known her from a babe." Mrs. Gibson took up arms on behalf of her own daughter, or rather, she took up arms against Molly's praises. "I don't think you would have called Molly a lady the other day, Miss Browning, if you had found her where I did, sitting up in a cherry tree, 6 feet from the ground at least, I do assure you." "Oh, but that wasn't pretty," said Miss Browning, shaking her head at Molly. "I thought you'd left off those tomboy ways." "She wants the refinement which good society gives in several ways," said Mrs. Gibson, returning to attack on poor Molly. "She's very apt to come upstairs 2 at a time." "Only 2, Molly!" said Cynthia. "Why, to-day I found I could manage 4 of these broad shallow steps." "My dear child, what are you saying?" "Only confessing that I, like Molly, want the refinement which good society gives. Therefore please do let us go to Miss Browning's this evening. I will pledge myself for Molly that she shan't sit in a cherry tree, and Molly shall see that I don't go upstairs in an unladylike way. I will go upstairs as meekly as if I were a come-out young lady, and had been to the Easter ball." So it was agreed that they should go. If Mr. Osborne Hamley had been named as one of the probable visitors, there would have been none of this difficulty about the affair. But though he was not there, his brother Roger was. Molly saw him in a minute when she entered the little drawing-room, but Cynthia did not. "And see, my dears," said Miss Phoebe Browning, turning them round to the side where Roger stood waiting for his turn of speaking to Molly, "we've got a gentleman for you after all. Wasn't it fortunate? Just as sister said that you might find it dull, you, Cynthia, she meant, because you know you come from France. And then, just as if he had been sent from heaven, Mr. Roger came in to call. And I won't say we laid violent hands on him, because he was too good for that, but really we should have been near it if he had not stayed of his own accord." The moment Roger had done his cordial greeting to Molly, he asked her to introduce him to Cynthia. "I want to know her, your new sister," he added, with the kind smile Molly remembered so well since the very first day she had seen it directed towards her, as she sat crying under the weeping ash. Cynthia was standing a little behind Molly when Roger asked for this introduction. She was generally dressed with careless grace. Molly, who was delicate neatness itself, used sometimes to wonder how Cynthia's tumbled gowns, tossed away so untidily, had the art of looking so well and falling in such graceful folds. For instance, the pale lilac muslin gown that she wore this evening had been worn many times before, and had looked unfit to wear again until Cynthia put it on. Then the limpness became softness, and the very creases took the lines of beauty. Molly, in a daintily clean pink muslin, did not look half so elegantly dressed as Cynthia. The grave eyes that the latter raised when she had to be presented to Roger had a sort of childlike innocence and wonder about them, which did not quite belong to Cynthia's character. She put on her armour of magic that evening, involuntarily, as she always did, but, on the other side, she could not help trying her power on strangers. Molly had always felt that she should have a right to a good long talk with Roger when she next saw him, and that he would tell her, or she should gather from him, all the details she so longed to hear about the Squire, about the Hall, about Osborne, about himself. He was just as cordial and friendly as ever with her. If Cynthia had not been there, all would have gone on as she had anticipated. But of all the victims to Cynthia's charms, he fell most prone and abject. Molly saw it all, as she was sitting next to Miss Phoebe at the tea-table, acting right hand, and passing cake, cream, sugar, with such busy assiduity, that every one besides herself thought that her mind, as well as her hands, was fully occupied. She tried to talk to the 2 shy girls, as in virtue of her 2-year seniority she thought herself bound to do, and the consequence was, she went upstairs with the twain clinging to her arms, and willing to swear an eternal friendship. Nothing would satisfy them but that she must sit between them at 20 ans, and they were so desirous of her advice in the important point of fixing the price of the counters that she could not even have joined in the animated tête-à-tête going on between Roger and Cynthia. Or rather, it would be more correct to say that Roger was talking in a most animated manner to Cynthia, whose sweet eyes were fixed upon his face with a look of great interest in all he was saying, while it was only now and then that she made her low replies. Molly caught a few words occasionally in intervals of business. "At my uncle's, we always gave a silver threepence for 3 dozen. You know what a silver threepence is, don't you, dear Miss Gibson?" "The 3 classes are published in the Senate House at 9 o'clock on Friday morning, and you can't imagine—" "I think it would be thought rather shabby to play at anything less than 6pence. That gentleman," this in a whisper, "is at Cambridge, and you know they always play very high there, and sometimes ruin themselves, don't they, dear Miss Gibson?" "On this occasion, the Master of Arts who precedes the candidates for honours when they go into the Senate House is called the Father of the College to which he belongs. I think I mentioned that before, didn't I?" So Cynthia was hearing all about Cambridge, and the very examination about which Molly had felt such keen interest, without having ever been able to have her questions answered by a competent person. And Roger, to whom she had always looked as the final and most satisfactory answerer, was telling all she wanted to know, and she could not listen. It took all her patience to make up little packets of counters, and settle, as the arbiter of the game, whether it would be better for the round or the oblong counters to be reckoned as 6. When all was done, and every one sate in their places round the table, Roger and Cynthia had to be called twice before they came. They stood up, it is true, at the first sound of their names, but they did not move. Roger went on talking, Cynthia listening, till the second call, when they hurried to the table, and tried to appear all on a sudden quite interested in the great questions of the game, namely, the price of 3 dozen counters, and whether, all things considered, it would be better to call the round counters or the oblong, 1/2 dozen each. Miss Browning, drumming the pack of cards on the table, and quite ready to begin dealing, decided the matter by saying, "Rounds are 6s, and 3 dozen counters cost 6pence. Pay up, if you please, and let us begin at once." Cynthia sate between Roger and William Osborne, the young schoolboy, who bitterly resented on this occasion his sister's habit of calling him Willie, as he thought that it was this boyish sobriquet which prevented Cynthia from attending as much to him as to Mr. Roger Hamley. He was also charmed by the charmer, who found leisure to give him 1 or 2 of her sweet smiles. On his return home to his grandmamma's, he gave out 1 or 2 very decided and rather original opinions, quite opposed, as was natural, to his sister's. One was, that after all a senior wrangler was no great shakes, any man might be one if he liked, but there were a lot of fellows that he knew who would be very sorry to go in for anything so slow. Molly thought the game would never end. She had no particular turn for gambling in her, and whatever her card might be, she regularly put 2 counters, indifferent as to whether she won or lost. Cynthia, on the contrary, staked high, and was at one time very rich, but ended by being in debt to Molly something like 6 shillings. She had forgotten her purse, she said, and was obliged to borrow from the more provident Molly, who was aware that the round game of which Miss Browning had spoken to her was likely to require money. If it was not a very merry affair for all the individuals concerned, it was a very noisy one on the whole. Molly thought it was going to last till midnight, but punctually as the clock struck 9, the little maid-servant staggered in under the weight of a tray loaded with sandwiches, cakes, and jelly. This brought on a general move, and Roger, who appeared to have been on the watch for something of the kind, came and took a chair by Molly. "I am so glad to see you again. It seems such a long time since Christmas," said he, dropping his voice, and not alluding more exactly to the day when she had left the hall. "It is a long time," she replied. "We are close to Easter now. I have so wanted to tell you how glad I was to hear about your honours at Cambridge. I once thought of sending you a message through your brother, but then I thought it might be making too much fuss, because I knew nothing of mathematics, or of the value of a senior wranglership, and you were sure to have so many congratulations from people who did know." "I missed yours, though, Molly," he said kindly, "but I felt sure you were glad for me." "Glad and proud too," said she. "I should so like to hear something more about it. I heard you telling Cynthia." "Yes, what a charming person she is! I should think you must be happier than we expected long ago." "But tell me something about the senior wranglership, please," said Molly. It's a long story, and I ought to be helping the Miss Brownings to hand sandwiches. Besides, you wouldn't find it very interesting. It's so full of technical details." "Cynthia looked very much interested," said Molly. "Well, then I refer you to her, for I must go now. I can't for shame go on sitting here and letting those good ladies have all the trouble. But I shall come and call on Mrs. Gibson soon. Are you walking home to-night?" "Yes, I think so," replied Molly, eagerly foreseeing what was to come. "Then I shall walk home with you. I left my horse at the George, and that's half-way. I suppose old Betty will allow me to accompany you and your sister. You used to describe her as something of a dragon." "Betty has left us," said Molly sadly. "She's gone to live at a place at Ashcombe." He made a face of dismay, and then went off to his duties. The short conversation had been very pleasant, and his manner had had just the brotherly kindness of old times, but it was not quite the manner he had to Cynthia, and Molly half thought she would have preferred the latter. He was now hovering about Cynthia, who had declined the offer of refreshments from Willie Osborne. Roger was tempting her, and with playful entreaties urging her to take something from him. Every word they said could be heard by the whole room, yet every word was said, on Roger's part at least, as if he could not have spoken it in that peculiar manner to any one else. At length, and rather more because she was weary of being entreated than because it was his wish, Cynthia took a macaroon, and Roger seemed as happy as though she had crowned him with flowers. The whole affair was as trifling and commonplace as could be in itself hardly worth noticing, and yet Molly did notice it, and felt uneasy. She could not tell why. As it turned out, it was a rainy night, and Mrs. Gibson sent a fly for the two girls instead of old Betty's substitute. Both Cynthia and Molly thought of the possibility of their taking the two Osborne girls back to their grandmother's, and so saving them a wet walk. But Cynthia got the start in speaking about it, and the thanks and the implied praise for thoughtfulness were hers. When they got home, Mr. and Mrs. Gibson were sitting in the drawing-room, quite ready to be amused by any details of the evening. Cynthia began, "Oh, it wasn't very entertaining. One didn't expect that," and she yawned wearily. "Who were there?" asked Mr. Gibson. "Quite a young party, wasn't it?" They'd only asked Lizzie and Fanny Osborne and their brother, but Mr. Roger Hamley had ridden over and called on the Miss Brownings, and they had kept him to tea. No one else. "Roger Hamley there," said Mr. Gibson. "He's come home, then. I must make time to ride over and see him." "You'd much better ask him here," said Mrs. Gibson. "Suppose you invite him and his brother to dine here on Friday, my dear. It would be a very pretty attention, I think." "My dear, these young Cambridge men have very good taste in wine, and don't spare it. My cellar won't stand many of their attacks." "I didn't think you were so inhospitable, Mr. Gibson." "I'm not inhospitable, I'm sure. If you'll put bitter beer in the corner of your notes of invitation, just as the smart people put quadrilles as a sign of entertainment offered, we'll have Osborne and Roger to dinner any day you like. And what did you think of my favourite, Cynthia? You hadn't seen him before, I think." "Oh, he's nothing like so handsome as his brother, nor so polished, nor so easy to talk to. He entertained me for more than an hour, with a long account of some examination or other. But there's something one likes about him." "Well, and Molly?" said Mrs. Gibson, who piqued herself on being an impartial stepmother, and who always tried hard to make Molly talk as much as Cynthia. "What sort of an evening have you had?" "Very pleasant, thank you." Her heart a little belied her as she said this. She had not cared for the round game, and she would have cared for Roger's conversation. She had had what she was indifferent to, and not had what she would have liked. "We've had an unexpected visitor, too," said Mr. Gibson. "Just after dinner, who should come in but Mr. Preston. I fancy he's having more of the management of the Hollingford property than formerly. Sheepshanks is getting an old man, and if so, I suspect we shall see a good deal of Preston. He's no blate, as they used to say in Scotland, and made himself quite at home to-night. If I'd asked him to stay, or indeed, if I'd done anything but yawn, he'd have been here now. But I defy any man to stay when I have a fit of yawning." "Do you like Mr. Preston, papa?" asked Molly. "About as much as I do half the men I meet. He talks well, and has seen a good deal. I know very little of him, though, except that he's my lord's steward, which is a guarantee for a good deal. Lady Harriet spoke pretty strongly against him that day I was with her at the Manor House." Lady Harriet's always full of fancies. She likes persons to-day and dislikes them to-morrow," said Mrs. Gibson, who was touched on her sore point whenever Molly quoted Lady Harriet, or said anything to imply ever so transitory an intimacy with her. "You must know a good deal about Mr. Preston, my dear. I suppose you saw a good deal of him at Ashcombe." Mrs. Gibson coloured, and looked at Cynthia before she replied. Cynthia's face was set into a determination not to speak, however much she might be referred to. "Yes, we saw a good deal of him at one time, I mean. But he always sent us game and sometimes fruit. There were some stories against him, but I never believed them." "What kind of stories?" said Mr. Gibson quickly. "Oh, vague stories, you know, scandal, I dare say. No one ever believed them. He could be so agreeable if he chose, and my lord, who is so very particular, would never have kept him as agent if they were true. Not that I ever knew what they were, for I consider all scandal as abominable gossip." "I'm very glad I yawned in his face," said Mr. Gibson. "I hope he'll take the hint." "If it was one of your giant gapes, papa, I should call it more than a hint," said Molly. "And if you want a yawning chorus the next time he comes, I'll join in. Won't you, Cynthia?" "I don't know," replied the latter shortly, as she lighted her bed candle. The two girls had usually some nightly conversation in one or other of their bedrooms, but to-night Cynthia said something or other about being terribly tired, and hastily shut her door. The very next day, Roger came to pay his promised call. Molly was out in the garden with Williams, planning the arrangement of some new flower beds, and deep in her employment of placing pegs upon the lawn to mark out the different situations, when, standing up to mark the effect, her eye was caught by the figure of a gentleman, sitting with his back to the light, leaning forwards and talking or listening eagerly. Molly knew the shape of the head perfectly, and hastily began to pull off her brown holland gardening apron, emptying the pockets as she spoke to Williams. "You can finish it now, I think," said she. "You know about the bright coloured flowers being against the privet hedge, and where the new rose bed is to be." "I can't justly say as I do," said he. "Maybe you'll just go o'er it all once again, Miss Molly. I'm not so young as I once was, and my head is not so clear nowadays, and I'd be loth to make mistakes when you're so set upon your plans." Molly gave up her impulse in a moment. She saw that the old gardener was really perplexed, yet that he was as anxious as he could be to do his best. So she went over the ground again, pegging and explaining, till the wrinkled brow was smooth again, and he kept saying, "I see, miss. All right, Miss Molly. I's gotten it in my head as clear as patchwork now." So she could leave him and go in. But just as she was close to the garden door, Roger came out. It really was for once a case of virtue its own reward, for it was far pleasanter to her to have him in a tête-à-tête, however short, than in the restraint of Mrs. Gibson's and Cynthia's presence. "I only just found out where you were, Molly. Mrs. Gibson said you had gone out, but she didn't know where, and it was the greatest chance that I turned round and saw you." "I saw you some time ago, but I couldn't leave Williams. I think he was unusually slow to-day, and he seemed as if he couldn't understand my plan for the new flower beds." "Is that the paper you've got in your hands? Let me look at it, will you? Ah, I see. You've borrowed some of your ideas from our garden at home, haven't you? This bed of scarlet geraniums, with the border of young oaks pegged down. That was a fancy of my dear mother's." They were both silent for a minute or two. Then Molly said, "How is the Squire? I've never seen him since." "No, he told me how much he wanted to see you, but he couldn't make up his mind to come and call. I suppose it would never do now for you to come and stay at the Hall, would it? It would give my father so much pleasure. He looks upon you as a daughter, and I'm sure both Osborne and I shall always consider you are like a sister to us, after all my mother's love for you, and your tender care of her at last. But I suppose it wouldn't do." "No, certainly not," said Molly, hastily. "I fancy if you could come, it would put us a little to rights. You know, as I think I once told you, Osborne has behaved differently to what I should have done, though not wrongly, only what I call an error of judgment. But my father, I'm sure, has taken up some notion of never mind, only the end of it is that he holds Osborne still in tacit disgrace, and is miserable himself all the time. Osborne, too, is sore and unhappy, and estranged from my father. It is just what my mother would have put right very soon, and perhaps you could have done it, unconsciously, I mean. For this wretched mystery that Osborne preserves about his affairs is at the root of it all. But there's no use talking about it. I don't know why I began." Then, with a wrench, changing the subject, while Molly still thought of what he had been telling her, he broke out, I can't tell you how much I like Miss Kirkpatrick, Molly. It must be a great pleasure to you, having such a companion." "Yes," said Molly, half smiling. "I'm very fond of her, and I think I like her better every day I know her. But how quickly you have found out her virtues!" "I didn't say virtues, did I?" asked he, reddening, but putting the question in all good faith. "Yet I don't think one could be deceived in that face, and Mrs. Gibson appears to be a very friendly person. She has asked Osborne and me to dine here on Friday." Bitter beer came into Molly's mind, but what she said was, "And are you coming?" "Certainly I am, unless my father wants me; and I've given Mrs. Gibson a conditional promise for Osborne too. So I shall see you all very soon again. But I must go now. I have to keep an appointment 7 miles from here in half an hour's time. Good luck to your flower garden, Molly." This is the end of Chapter 21, The Half-Sisters. Read by Tora in Yellowstone National Park, October 2006.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 22. The Old Squire's Troubles. Affairs were going on worse at the Hall than Roger had liked to tell. Moreover, very much of the discomfort there arose from mere manner, as people express it, which is always indescribable and indefinable. Quiet and passive as Mrs. Hamley had always been in appearance, she was the ruling spirit of the house as long as she lived. The directions to the servants, down to the most minute particulars, came from her sitting room, or from the sofa on which she lay. Her children always knew where to find her, and to find her was to find love and sympathy. Her husband, who was often restless and angry from one cause or another, always came to her to be smoothed down and put right. He was conscious of her pleasant influence over him, and became at peace with himself when in her presence, just as a child is at ease when with some one who is both firm and gentle. But the keystone of the family arch was gone, and the stones of which it was composed began to fall apart. It is always sad when a sorrow of this kind seems to injure the character of the mourning survivors. Yet, perhaps, this injury may be only temporary or superficial. The judgments so constantly passed upon the way people bear the loss of those whom they have deeply loved, appear to be even more cruel, and wrongly meted out, than human judgments generally are. To careless observers, for instance, it would seem as though the Squire was rendered more capricious and exacting, more passionate and authoritative, by his wife's death. The truth was, that it occurred at a time when many things came to harass him, and some to bitterly disappoint him, and she was no longer there to whom he used to carry his sore heart for the gentle balm of her sweet words. So the sore heart ached and smarted internally, and often, when he saw how his violent conduct affected others, he could have cried out for their pity, instead of their anger and resentment. "Have mercy upon me, for I am very miserable." How often have such dumb thoughts gone up from the hearts of those who have taken hold of their sorrow by the wrong end, as prayers against sin! And when the Squire saw that his servants were learning to dread him, and his firstborn to avoid him, he did not blame them. He knew he was becoming a domestic tyrant. It seemed as if all circumstances conspired against him, and as if he was too weak to struggle with them. Else, why did everything indoors and out of doors go so wrong just now, when all he could have done, had things been prosperous, was to have submitted in very imperfect patience to the loss of his wife but just when he needed ready money to pacify Osborne's creditors, the harvest had turned out remarkably plentiful, and the price of corn had sunk down to a level it had not touched for years. The Squire had insured his life at the time of his marriage for a pretty large sum. It was to be a provision for his wife if she had survived him, and for their younger children. Roger was the only representative of these interests now, but the Squire was unwilling to lose the insurance by ceasing to pay the annual sum. He would not, if he could, have sold any part of the estate which he inherited from his father, and, besides, it was strictly entailed. He had sometimes thought how wise a step it would have been could he have sold a portion of it, and with the purchase money have drained and reclaimed the remainder. And at length, learning from some neighbour that government would make certain advances for drainage, at a very low rate of interest, on condition that the work was done and the money repaid within a given time, his wife had urged him to take advantage of the proffered loan. But now that she was no longer here to encourage him, and take an interest in the progress of the work, he grew indifferent to it himself, and cared no more to go out on his stout roan cob, and sit square on his seat, watching the labourers on the marshy land all overgrown with rushes, speaking to them from time to time in their own strong nervous country dialect. But the interest to government had to be paid all the same, whether the men worked well or ill. Then the roof of the hall let in the melted snow water this winter, and, on examination, it turned out that a new roof was absolutely required. The men who had come about the advances made to Osborne by the London moneylender had spoken despairingly of the timber on the estate, very fine trees sound, perhaps, too, 50 years ago, but gone to rot now, had wanted lopping and clearings. Was there no wood ranger or forester? They were nothing like the value young Mr. Hamley had represented them to be of. The remarks had come round to the Squire's ears. He loved the trees he had played under as a boy as if they were living creatures. That was on the romantic side of his nature. Merely looking at them as representing so many pounds sterling, he had esteemed them highly, and had had, until now, no opinion of another by which to correct his own judgment. So these words of the valuers cut him sharp, although he affected to disbelieve them, and tried to persuade himself that he did so. But, after all, these cares and disappointments did not touch the root of his deep resentment against Osborne. There is nothing like wounded affection for giving poignancy to anger, and the Squire believed that Osborne and his advisers had been making calculations based upon his own death. He hated the idea so much it made him so miserable that he would not face it, and define it, and meet it with full inquiry and investigation. He chose rather to cherish the morbid fancy that he was useless in this world, born under an unlucky star, that all things went badly under his management. But he did not become humble in consequence. He put his misfortunes down to the score of fate, not to his own. And he imagined that Osborne saw his failures, and that his firstborn grudged him his natural term of life. All these fancies would have been set to rights could he have talked them over with his wife, or even had he been accustomed to mingle much in the society of those whom he esteemed his equals. But, as has been stated, he was inferior in education to those who should have been his mates, and perhaps the jealousy and the mauvaise honte that his inferiority had called out long ago extended itself in some measure to the feelings he entertained towards his sons, less to Roger than to Osborne, though the former was turning out by far the most distinguished man but Roger was practical, interested in all out-of-doors things, and he enjoyed the details, homely enough, which his father sometimes gave him of the everyday occurrences which the latter had noticed in the woods and the fields. Osborne, on the contrary, was what is commonly called fine, delicate, almost to effeminacy in dress and in manner, careful in small observances. All this his father had been rather proud of in the days when he had looked forward to a brilliant career at Cambridge for his son. He had at that time regarded Osborne's fastidiousness and elegance as another stepping stone to the high and prosperous marriage which was to restore the ancient fortunes of the Hamley family. But now that Osborne had barely obtained his degree, that all the boastings of his father had proved vain, that the fastidiousness had led to unexpected expenses, to attribute the most innocent cause to Osborne's debts, poor young man's ways and manners became a subject of irritation to his father. Osborne was still occupied with his books and his writings when he was at home, and this mode of passing the greater part of the day gave him but few subjects in common with his father when they did meet at meal times or in the evenings. Perhaps if Osborne had been able to have more out-of-door amusements it would have been better, but he was short-sighted and cared little for the carefully observant pursuits of his brother. He knew but few young men of his own standing in the county. His hunting even, of which he was passionately fond, had been curtailed this season. As his father had disposed of one of the two hunters, he had been hitherto allowed. The whole stable establishment had been reduced, perhaps because it was the economy which told most on the enjoyment of both the Squire and Osborne, and which, therefore, the former took a savage pleasure in enforcing. The old carriage, a heavy family coach brought in the days of a comparative prosperity, was no longer needed after Madam's death, and fell to pieces in the cobwebbed seclusion of the coach-house. The best of the two carriage horses was taken for a gig, which the Squire now set up, saying many a time to all who might care to listen to him that it was the first time for generations that the Hamleys of Hamley had not been able to keep their own coach. The other carriage horse was turned out to grass, being too old for regular work. Conqueror used to come whining up to the park palings whenever he saw the Squire, who had always a piece of bread or some sugar or an apple for the old favourite, and made many a complaining speech to the dumb animal, telling him of the change of times since both were in their prime. It had never been the Squire's custom to encourage his boys to invite their friends to the Hall. Perhaps this, too, was owing to his mauvaise honte, and also to an exaggerated consciousness of the deficiencies of his establishment as compared with what he imagined these lads were accustomed to at home. He explained this once or twice to Osborne and Roger when they were at Rugby. You see, all you public schoolboys have a kind of freemasonry of your own, and outsiders are looked on by you much as I look on rabbits and all that isn't game. Ah, you may laugh, but it is so, and your friends will throw their eyes askance at me, and never think on my pedigree, which would beat theirs all to shivers, I'll be bound. No, I'll have no one here at the Hall who will look down on a Hamley of Hamley, even if he only knows how to make a cross instead of write his name. Then, of course, they must not visit at houses to whose sons the Squire could not or would not return a like hospitality. On all these points Mrs. Hamley had used her utmost influence without avail. His prejudices were immovable, as regarded his position as head of the oldest family in 3 counties, His pride was invincible, as regarded himself personally ill at ease in the society of his equals, deficient in manners, and in education his morbid sensitiveness was too sore and too self-conscious to be called humility. Take one instance from among many similar scenes of the state of feelings between the Squire and his eldest son, which, if it could not be called active discord, showed at least passive estrangement. It took place on an evening in the March succeeding Mrs. Hamley's death. Roger was at Cambridge. Osborne had also been from home, and he had not volunteered any information as to his absence. The Squire believed that Osborne had been either in Cambridge with his brother or in London. He would have liked to hear where his son had been, what had he been doing, and whom he had seen, purely as pieces of news, and as some diversions from the domestic worries and cares which were pressing him hard. But he was too proud to ask any questions, and Osborne had not given him any details of his journey. This silence had aggravated the Squire's internal dissatisfaction, and he came home to dinner, weary and sore-hearted, a day or two after Osborne's return. It was just 6 o'clock, and he went hastily into his own little business room on the ground floor, and, after washing his hands, came into the drawing-room, feeling as if he were very late. But the room was empty. He glanced at the clock over the mantelpiece as he tried to warm his hands at the fire. The fire had been neglected, and had gone out during the day. It was now piled with half-dried wood, which spattered and smoked instead of doing its duty in blazing and warming the room, through which the keen wind was cutting its way in all directions. The clock had stopped. No one had remembered to wind it up, but by the Squire's watch it was already past dinner-time. The old butler put his head into the room, but, seeing the Squire alone, he was about to draw it back and wait for Mr. Osborne before announcing dinner. He had hoped to do this unperceived, but the Squire caught him in the act. "Why isn't dinner ready?" he called out sharply. "It's 10 minutes past 6. And, pray, why are you using this wood? It's impossible to get oneself warm by such a fire as this." "I believe, sir, that Thomas—" "Don't talk to me of Thomas. Send dinner in directly." About 5 minutes elapsed, spent by the hungry Squire in all sorts of impatient ways attacking Thomas, who came in to look after the fire, knocking the logs about, scattering out sparks, but considerably lessening the chances of warmth, touching up the candles, which appeared to him to give a light unusually insufficient for the large cold room. While he was doing this, Osborne came in dressed in full evening dress. He always moved slowly, and this, to begin with, irritated the Squire. Then an uncomfortable consciousness of a rough black coat, drab trousers, check cotton cravat, and splashed boots forced itself upon him as he saw Osborne's point device costume. He chose to consider it affection and finery in Osborne, and was on the point of bursting out with some remark, when the butler, who had watched Osborne downstairs before making the announcement, came in to say that dinner was ready. "It surely isn't 6 o'clock," said Osborne, pulling out his dainty little watch. He was scarcely more aware than it of the storm that was brewing. 6 o'clock! It's more than a quarter past," growled his father. "I fancy your watch must be wrong, sir. I set mine by the Horse Guards only 2 days ago." Now, impugning that old steady, turnip-shaped watch of the Squire's was one of the insults which, as it could not reasonably be resented, was not to be forgiven. That watch had been given him by his father when watches were watches long ago. It had given the law to the house clocks, stable clocks, kitchen clocks, nay, even to Hamley church clock in its day, and was it now, in its respectable old age, to be looked down upon by a little whippersnapper of a French watch which could go into a man's waistcoat pocket, instead of having to be extricated with due effort like a respectable watch of size and position from a fob in the waistband. No, not if the whippersnapper were backed by all the horse guards that ever were, with the life guards to boot. Poor Osborne might have known better than to cast this slur on his father's flesh and blood, for so dear did he hold his watch. "My watch is like myself," said the Squire, gurning, as the Scotch say, plain, but steady going. "At any rate, it gives the law in my house. The King may go by the horse guards if he likes." "I beg your pardon, sir," said Osborne, really anxious to keep the peace. "I went by my watch, which is certainly right by London time, and I'd no idea you were waiting for me. Otherwise I could have dressed much quicker." "I should think so," said the Squire, looking sarcastically at his son's attire. "When I was a young man I should have been ashamed to have spent as much time at my looking-glass as if I'd been a girl. I could make myself as smart as anyone when I was going to a dance, or to a party where I was likely to meet pretty girls. But I should have laughed myself to scorn if I'd stood fiddle-faddling at a glass smirking at my own likeness, all for my own pleasure." Osborne reddened, and was on the point of letting fly some caustic remark on his father's dress at the present moment, but he contented himself with saying in a low voice, "My mother always expected us all to dress for dinner. I got into the habit of doing it to please her, and I keep it up now." Indeed, he had a certain kind of feeling of loyalty to her memory in keeping up all the little domestic habits and customs she had instituted or preferred. But the contrast which the Squire thought was implied by Osborne's remark put him beside himself. "And I, too, try to attend to her wishes. I do. And in more important things. I did when she was alive, and I do so now." "I never said you did not," said Osborne, astonished at his father's passionate words and manner. "Yes, you did, sir. You meant it. I could see by your looks. I saw you look at my morning coat. At any rate, I never neglected any wish of hers in her lifetime. If she'd wished me to go to school again and learn my ABC, I would. I would. And I wouldn't have gone playing me, and lounging away my time, for fear of vexing and disappointing her. Yet some folks older than schoolboys—" The Squire choked here, but though the words would not come his passion did not diminish. "I'll not have you casting up your mother's wishes to me, sir. You, who went near to break her heart at last." Osborne was strongly tempted to get up and leave the room. Perhaps it would have been better if he had. It might then have brought about an explanation and a reconciliation between father and son. But he thought he did well in sitting still and appearing to take no notice. This indifference to what he was saying appeared to annoy the Squire still more, and he kept on grumbling and talking to himself till Osborne, unable to bear it any longer, said, very quietly, but very bitterly, "I am only a cause of irritation to you, and home is no longer home to me, but a place in which I am to be controlled in trifles, and scolded about trifles as if I were a child. Put me in a way of making a living for myself. That much your older son has a right to ask of you I will, then leave this house, and you shall be no longer vexed by my dress, or my want of punctuality. You make your request pretty much as another son did long ago. Give me the portion that falleth to me. But I don't think what he did with his money is much encouragement for me, too." Then the thought of how little he could give his son his portion, or any part of it, stopped the Squire. Osborne took up the speech. "I'm as ready as any man to earn my living, only the preparation for any profession will cost money, and money I haven't got." "No more have I," said the Squire shortly. "What is it to be done then?" said Osborne, only half believing his father's words. "Why, you must learn to stop at home, and not take expensive journeys, and you must redeem your tailor's bills. I don't ask you to help me in the management of the land, you're far too fine a gentleman for that. But if you can't earn money, at least you needn't spend it." "I've told you I'm willing enough to earn money," cried Osborne, passionately at last. "But how am I to do it? You really are very unreasonable, sir." "Am I?" said the Squire, cooling in manner, though not in temper, as Osborne grew warm. "But I don't set up for being reasonable. Men who have to pay away money that they haven't got for their extravagant sons aren't likely to be reasonable. There's two things you've gone and done which put me beside myself. When I think of them, you've turned out next door to a dunce at college, when your poor mother thought so much of you, and when you might have pleased and gratified her so if you chose, and, well, I won't say what the other thing is." "Tell me, sir," said Osborne, almost breathless with the idea that his father had discovered his secret marriage. But the father was thinking of the money-lenders, who were calculating how soon Osborne would come into the estate. "No," said the Squire. "I know what I know, and I'm not going to tell you how I know it. Only, I'll just say this, your friends no more know a piece of good timber when they see it than you or I know how you could earn £5 if it was to keep you from starving. Now, there's Roger, we none of us made an ado about him, but he'll have his fellowship now, I'll warrant him, and be a bishop, or a chancellor, or something, before we've found out he's clever. We've been so much taken up thinking about you. I don't know what's come over me to speak of we in this way," said he, suddenly dropping his voice, a change of tone as sad could be. "I ought to say I. It will be I for evermore in this world." He got up and left the room in quick haste, knocking over his chair and not stopping to pick it up. Osborne, who was sitting and shading his eyes with his hand, as he had been doing for some time, looked up at the noise, and then rose as quickly and hurried after his father, only in time to hear the study door locked on the inside the moment he reached it. Osborne returned into the dining-room, chagrined and sorrowful. But he was always sensitive to any omission of the usual observances, which might excite remark, and even with his heavy heart he was careful to pick up the fallen chair, and restore it to its place near the bottom of the table, and afterwards so to disturb the dishes as to make it appear that they had been touched, before ringing for Robinson. When the latter came in, followed by Thomas, Osborne thought it necessary to say to him that his father was not well, and had gone into the study, and that he himself wanted no dessert, but would have a cup of coffee in the drawing-room. The old butler sent Thomas out of the room, and came up confidentially to Osborne. "I thought master wasn't justly himself, Mr. Osborne, before dinner, and therefore I made excuses for him, I did. He spoke to Thomas about the fire, sir, which is a thing I could in no wise put up with, unless by reason of sickness, which I am always ready to make allowances for." "Why shouldn't my father speak to Thomas?" said Osborne. "But perhaps he spoke angrily. I daresay, for I'm sure he's not well." "No, Mr. Osborne, it wasn't that. I myself am given to anger, and I'm blessed with as good health as any man in my years. Besides, anger's a good thing for Thomas. He needs a deal of it. But it should come from the right quarter, and that is me myself, Mr. Osborne. I know my place, and I know my rights and duties as well as any butler that lives. And it's my duty to scold Thomas, and not master's. Master ought to have said, 'Robinson, you must speak to Thomas about letting out the fire,' and I'd ha' given it him well, as I shall do now, for that matter. But as I said before, I make excuses for master, as being in mental distress and bodily ill health. So I've brought myself round not to give warning, as I should have done for certain under happier circumstances. Really, Robinson, I think it's all great nonsense, said Osborne, weary of the long story the butler had told him, and to which he had not half attended. What in the world does it signify whether my father speaks to you or to Thomas? Bring me coffee in the drawing-room, and don't trouble your head any more about scolding Thomas. Robinson went away offended at his grievance being called nonsense. He kept muttering to himself in the intervals of scolding Thomas, and saying things is a deal changed since poor missus went. I don't wonder master feels it, for I'm sure I do. She was a lady who had always a becoming respect for a butler's position, and could have understood how he might be hurt in his mind. She'd never have called his delicacies of feelings nonsense, not she. No more would Mr. Roger. He's a merry young gentleman, and over fond of bringing dirty, slimy creatures into the house, but he's always a kind word for a man who is hurt in his mind. He'd cheer up the Squire, and keep him from getting so cross and wilful. I wish Mr. Roger was here, I do. The poor Squire, shut up with his grief and his ill temper as well, in the dingy, dreary study in which he daily spent more and more of his indoors life, turned over his cares and troubles till he was as bewildered with the process as a squirrel must be in going round in a cage. He had out day books and ledgers, and was calculating up back rents, and every time the sum totals came to different amounts, he could have cried like a child over his sums. He was worn out and weary, angry and disappointed. He closed his books at last with a bang. I'm getting old, he said, and my head's less clear than it used to be. I think sorrow for her has dazed me. I never was much to boast on, but she thought a deal of me, bless her. She'd never let me call myself stupid, but, for all that, I am stupid. Osborne ought to help me. He's had money enough spent on his learning, but instead he comes down dressed like a popinjay, and never troubles his head to think how I'm to pay his debts. I wish I'd told him to earn his living as a dancing master, said the Squire, with a sad smile at his own wit. He's dressed for all the world like one, and how he spent the money no one knows. Perhaps Roger will turn up some day with a heap of creditors at his heels. No, he won't, not Roger. He may be slow, but he's steady. It's old Roger. I wish he was here. He's not the eldest son, but he'd take an interest in the estate, and he'd do up these weary accounts for me. I wish Roger was here. End of chapter 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 23. Osborne Hamley reviews his position. Osborne had his solitary cup of coffee in the drawing-room. He was very unhappy too, after his fashion. He stood on the hearth-rug pondering over his situation. He was not exactly aware how hardly his father was pressed for ready money. The Squire had never spoken to him on the subject without being angry, and many of his loose contradictory statements, all of which, however contradictory they might appear, had their basis in truth, were set down by his son to the exaggeration of passion. But it was uncomfortable enough to a young man of Osborne's age to feel himself continually hampered for want of £5 note. The principal supplies for the liberal, almost luxurious table at the Hall came off the estate, so that there was no appearance of poverty as far as the household went, and as long as Osborne was content at home, he had everything he could wish for. But he had a wife elsewhere. He wanted to see her continually, and that necessitated journeys. She, poor thing, had to be supported, Where was the money for the journeys and for Amy's modest wants to come from? That was the puzzle in Osborne's mind just now. While he had been at college, his allowance heir of the Hamleys had been 300, while Roger had to be content with 100 less. The payment of these annual sums had given the Squire a good deal of trouble, but he thought of it as merely temporary inconvenience. Perhaps unreasonably thought so. Osborne was to do great things, take high honours, get a fellowship, marry a long-descended heiress, live in some of the many uninhabited rooms at the Hall, and help the Squire in the management of the estate that would sometime be his. Roger was to be a clergyman. Steady, slow Roger was just fitted for that, and when he declined entering the church, preferring a life of more activity and adventure, Roger was to be anything. He was useful and practical, and fit for all the employments from which Osborne was shut out of by his fastidiousness and his persuado genius. So it was well he was an eldest son, for he would never have done to struggle through the world. And as for his settling down to a profession, it would be like cutting blocks with a razor. And now here was Osborne, living at home, but longing to be elsewhere. His allowance stopped in reality. Indeed, the punctual payment of it during the last year or two had been owing to his mother's exertions, but nothing had been said about its present cessation by either father or son. Money matters were too sore a subject between them. Every now and then the Squire threw him a £10 note or so, but the sort of suppressed growl with which they were given, and the entire uncertainty as to when he might receive them, rendered any calculation based upon their receipt exceedingly vague and uncertain. "What in the world can I do to secure an income?" thought Osborne, as he stood on the hearth-rug, his back to a blazing fire, his cup of coffee sent up in the rare old china that had belonged to the Hall for generations, his dress finished, as dress of Osborne's could hardly fail to be. One could hardly have thought that this elegant young man, standing there in the midst of comfort that verged on luxury, should have been turning over that one great problem in his mind, but so it was. "What can I do to be sure of a present income? Things cannot go on as they are. I should need support for 2 or 3 years, even if I entered myself at the Temple or Lincoln's Inn. It would be impossible to live on my pay in the army. Besides, I should hate that profession. In fact, there are evils attending all professions. I couldn't bring myself to become a member of any I've ever heard of. Perhaps I'm more fitted to take orders than anything else, but to be compelled to write weekly sermons, whether one had anything to say or not, and, probably, doomed only to associate with people below one in refinement and education. Yet poor Amy must have money. I can't bear to compare our dinners here, overloaded with joints and game and sweets, as Morgan will persist in sending them up, with Amy's 2 little mutton chops. Yet what would my father say if he knew I'd married a Frenchwoman? In his present mood he'd disinherit me, if that is possible, and he'd speak about her in a way I couldn't stand. A Roman Catholic too. Well, I don't repent it. I'd do it again. Only if my mother had been in good health, if she could have heard my story, and known Amy. As it is, I must keep it secret. But where to get money? Where to get money? Then he bethought him of his poems. Would they sell, and bring him in money? In spite of Milton, he thought they might, and he went to fetch his MSS. out of his room. He sat down near the fire, trying to study them with a critical eye, to represent public opinion as far as he could. He had changed his style since the Mrs. Hemans days. He was essentially imitative in his poetic faculty, and of late he had followed the lead of a popular writer of sonnets. He turned his poems over. They were almost equivalent to an autobiographical passage in his life. Arranging them in their order, they came as follows: to Amy, walking with a little child; to Amy, singing at her work; to Amy, turning away from me while I told my love; Amy's confession; Amy in despair; the foreign land in which my Amy dwells; the wedding ring; the wife. When he came to this last sonnet, he put down his bundle of papers and began to think. The wife, yes, and a French wife, and a Roman Catholic wife, and a wife who might be said to have been in service, and his father hatred of the French, both collectively and individually collectively, as tumultuous, brutal ruffians, who murdered their king, and committed all kinds of bloody atrocities, individually as represented by Boney, and the various caricatures of Johnny Crapaud that had been in full circulation about 25 years before, this time when the Squire had been young and capable of receiving impressions. As for the form of religion in which Mrs. Osborne Hamley had been brought up, it is enough to say that Catholic emancipation had begun to be talked about by some politicians, and that the sullen roar of the majority of Englishmen, at the bare idea of it, was surging in the distance with ominous threatenings. The very mention of such a measure before the Squire was, as Osborne well knew, like shaking a red flag before a bull. And then he considered that if Amy had had the unspeakable, the incomparable blessing of being born of English parents, in the very heart of England, Warwickshire, for instance, and had never heard of priests, or mass, or confession, or the Pope, or Guy Fawkes, but had been born, baptized, and bred in the Church of England, without having ever seen the outside of a dissenting meeting-house, or a Papist chapel even, with all these advantages, her having been what was the equivalent for bonne in English? Nursery governess was a term hardly invented. Nursery maid, with wages paid down once a quarter, liable to be dismissed at a month's warning, and having her tea and sugar doled out to her, would be a shock to his father's old ancestral pride that he would hardly ever get over. If he saw her, thought Osborne, if he could but see her. But if the Squire were to see Amy, he would also hear her speak her pretty broken English precious to her husband, as it was in it that she had confessed brokenly with her English tongue that she loved him soundly with her French heart, and Squire Hamley piqued himself on being a good hater of the French. She would make such a loving, sweet, docile little daughter to my father. She would go as near as any one could towards filling up the blank void in this house, if he would but have her. But he won't. He never would. And he shan't have the opportunity of scouting her. Yet if I called her Lucy in these sonnets, and if they made a great effect, were praised in Blackwood and the Quarterly, and all the world was agog to find out the author, and I told him my secret, I could, if I were successful, I think then he would ask who Lucy was, and I could tell him all then. If how, I hate ifs. If me, no ifs. My life has been based on whens, and first they have turned to ifs, and then they have vanished away. It was when Osborne gets honours, and then if Osborne, and then a failure altogether. Said to Amy, when my mother sees you, and now it is if my father saw her, with a very faint prospect of its ever coming to pass. So he let the evening hours flow on, and disappear in reveries like these, winding up with a sudden determination to try the fate of his poems with a publisher, with the direct expectation of getting money for them, and an ulterior fancy that, if successful, they might work wonders with this father. When Roger came home, Osborne did not let a day pass before telling his brother of his plans. He never did conceal anything long from Roger. The feminine part of his character made him always desirous of a confidant, and as sweet sympathy as he could extract, But Roger's opinion had no effect on Osborne's actions, and Roger knew this full well. So when Osborne began with, "I want your advice on a plan I have got in my head," Roger replied, "Someone told me that the Duke of Wellington's maxim was never to give advice unless he could enforce its being carried into effect. Now, I can't do that, and you know, old boy, you don't follow out my advice when you've got it." "Not always, I know. Not when it does not agree with my own opinion. You are thinking about this concealment of my marriage, but you're not up in all the circumstances. You know how fully I meant to have done it, if there had not been that row about my debts, and then my mother's illness and death. And now you've got no conception how my father is changed, how irritable he has become. Wait till you've been at home a week. Robinson, Morgan, it's the same with them all, but worst of all with me." "Poor fellow," said Roger. "I thought he looked terribly changed, shrunken, and his ruddiness of complexion altered. Why, he hardly takes half the exercise he used to do, so it's no wonder. He has turned away all the men off the new works, which used to be such an interest to him, and because the roan cob stumbled with him one day and nearly threw him, he won't ride it, and yet he won't sell it and buy another, which would be the sensible plan. So there are two old horses eating their heads off, while he is constantly talking about money and expense. And that brings me to what I was going to say. I'm desperately hard up for money, and so I've been collecting my poems, weeding them well, you know, going over them quite critically, in fact, and I want to know if you think Dayton would publish them. You've a name in Cambridge, you know, and I daresay he would look at them if you offered them to him." "I can but try," said Roger, "but I'm afraid you won't get much by them." "I don't expect much. I'm a new man and must make my name. I should be content with 100. If I'd £100, I'd set myself to do something. I might keep myself and Amy by my writings, while I studied for the bar. Or, if the worst came to the worst, £100 would take us to Australia." "Australia? Why, Osborne, what would you do there, and leave my father? I hope you'll never get your £100, if that's the use you're to make of it. Why, you'd break the Squire's heart." "It might have done once," said Osborne gloomily, "but it would not now. He looks at me askance, and shies away from conversation with me. Let me alone for noticing and feeling this kind of thing. It's this very susceptibility to outward things that give me what faculty I have, and it seems to me as if my bread, and my wife's too, were to depend upon it. You'll soon see for yourself the terms which I am on with my father." Roger did soon see. His father had slipped into a habit of silence at meal times, a habit which Osborne, who was troubled and anxious enough for his own part, had not striven to break. Father and son sat together, and exchanged all the necessary speeches connected with the occasion civilly enough, but it was a relief to them when their intercourse was over, and they separated, the father to brood over his sorrow and his disappointment, which were real and deep enough, and the injury he had received from his boy, which was exaggerated in his mind by his ignorance of the actual steps Osborne had taken to raise money. If the money lenders had calculated the chances of his father's life or death in making their bargain, Osborne himself had thought only of how soon and how easily he could get the money requisite for clearing him from all imperious claims at Cambridge, and for enabling him to follow Amy to her home in Alsace, and for the subsequent marriage. As yet, Roger had never seen his brother's wife. Indeed, he had only been taken into Osborne's full confidence after all was decided in which his advice could have been useful. And now, in the enforced separation, Osborne's whole thought, both the poetical and practical sides of his mind, ran upon the little wife who was passing her lonely days in farmhouse lodgings, wondering when her bridegroom husband would come to her next. With such an engrossing subject it was, perhaps, no wonder that he unconsciously neglected his father. But it was none the less sad at the time, and to be regretted in its consequences. "I may come in and have a pipe with you, sir, mayn't I?" said Roger that first evening, pushing gently against the study door, which his father held only half open. "You'll not like it," said the Squire, still holding the door against him, but speaking in a relenting tone. "The tobacco I use isn't what young men like. Better go and have a cigar with Osborne." "No, I want to sit with you, and I can stand pretty strong tobacco." Roger pushed in, the resistance slowly giving way before him. "It will make your clothes smell. You'll have to borrow Osborne's scents to sweeten yourself," said the Squire grimly, at the same time pushing a short smart amber-mouthed pipe to his son. "No, I'll have a churchwarden." "Why, father, do you think I'm a baby to put up with a doll's head like this?" Looking at the carving upon it, the Squire was pleased in his heart, though he did not choose to show it. He only said, "Osborne brought it me when he came back from Germany. That's 3 years ago." And then for some time they smoked in silence. But the voluntary companionship of his son was very soothing to the Squire, though not a word might be said. The speech he made showed the direction of his thoughts. Indeed, his words were always a transparent medium, through which the current might be seen. "A deal of man's life comes and goes in 3 years. I've found that out." And he puffed away at his pipe again, while Roger was turning over in his mind what answer to make to this truism. The Squire again stopped his smoking, and spoke. "I remember when there was all that fuss about the Prince of Wales being made regent. I read somewhere, I daresay it was in a newspaper, that kings and their heirs apparent were always on bad terms. Osborne was quite a little chap then. He used to go out riding with me on White Surrey. You won't remember the pony we called White Surrey?" "I remember it, but I thought it a tall horse in those days." "Ah, that was because you were such a small lad, you know. I had 7 horses in the stable then, not counting the farm horses. I don't recollect having a care then, except she was always delicate, you know. But what a beautiful boy Osborne was! He was always dressed in black velvet. It was a foppery, and it wasn't my doing, and it was all right, I'm sure. He's a handsome fellow now, but the sunshine has gone out of his face." "He's a good deal troubled about this money, and the anxiety he has given you," said Roger, rather taking his brother's feelings for granted. "Not he," said the Squire, taking the pipe out of his mouth, and hitting the bowl so sharply against the hob that it broke in pieces. "There, but never mind. I say, not he, Roger. He's none troubled about the money. It's easy getting money from Jews if you're the eldest son and the heir. They just ask, 'How old is your father, and has he had a stroke or a fit?' and it's settled out of hand. And then they come prowling about a place, and running down the timber and land. Don't let us speak of him. It's no good, Roger. He and I are out of tune, and it seems to me as if only God Almighty could put us to the rights. It's thinking of how he grieved her at last that makes me so bitter with him. And yet there's a deal of good in him, and he's so quick and clever. If only he'd give his mind to things. Now, you are always slow, Roger. All your masters used to say so." Roger laughed a little. "Yes, I'd many a nickname at school for my slowness," said he. "Never mind," said the Squire consolingly. "I'm sure I don't. If you were a clever fellow like Osborne yonder, you'd be all for caring for books and writing, and you'd perhaps find it as dull as he does to keep company with a bumpkin Squire Jones like me. Yet I daresay they think a deal of you at Cambridge," said he, after a pause. since you've got this fine wranglership. I'd nearly forgotten that the news came at such a miserable time." "Well, yes, they're always proud of the senior wrangler of the year up at Cambridge. Next year I must abdicate." The Squire sat and gazed into the embers, still holding his useless pipe stem. At last he said in a low voice, as if scarcely aware he had got a listener, "I used to write to her when she was away in London, and tell her the home news. But no letter will reach her now. Nothing reaches her." Roger started up. "Where's the tobacco box, father? Let me fill you another pipe." And when he had done so, he stopped over his father and stroked his cheek. The Squire shook his head. "You've only just come home, lad. You don't know me, as I am nowadays. Ask Robinson. I won't have you asking Osborne. He ought to keep it to himself, but any of the servants will tell you. I'm not like the same man for getting into passions with them. I used to be reckoned a good master, but that is past now. Osborne was once a little boy, and she was once alive, and I was once a good master. A good master. Yes, it is all past now." He took up his pipe and began to smoke afresh, and Roger, after a silence of some minutes, began a long story about some Cambridge man's misadventure on the hunting field, telling it with such humour that the Squire was beguiled into hearty laughing. When they rose to go to bed, his father said to Roger, "Well, we've had a pleasant evening at least." "I have, but perhaps you have not, for I'm but poor company now." "No, I don't know when I've passed a happier evening, father," said Roger, and he spoke truly, though he did not trouble himself to find out the cause of his happiness. End of chapter 23.
Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Read for LibriVox by Brenda Dane. Chapter 24. Mrs. Gibson's Little Dinner. All this had taken place before Roger's first meeting with Molly and Cynthia at the Miss Brownings, and the little dinner on the Friday at Mr. Gibson's, which followed in due sequence. Mrs. Gibson intended the Hamleys to find this dinner pleasant, and they did. Mr. Gibson was fond of the two young men, both for their parents' sake and their own, for he had known them since boyhood. And to those whom he liked, Mr. Gibson could be remarkably agreeable. Mrs. Gibson really gave them a welcome, and cordiality in a hostess is a very becoming mantle for any other deficiencies there may be. Cynthia and Molly looked their best, which was all the duty Mrs. Gibson absolutely required of them, as she was willing enough to take her full share in the conversation. Osborne fell to her lot, of course, and for some time he and she prattled on with all the ease of manner and commonplaceness of meaning which go far to make the art of polite conversation. Roger, who ought to have made himself agreeable to one or the other of the young ladies, was exceedingly interested in what Mr. Gibson was telling him of a paper on comparative osteology in some foreign journal of science, which Lord Hollingford was in the habit of forwarding to his friend, the country surgeon. Yet every now and then, while he listened, he caught his attention wandering to the face of Cynthia, who was placed between his brother and Mr. Gibson. She was not particularly occupied with attending to anything that was going on. Her eyelids were carelessly dropped as she crumbled her bread on the tablecloth, and her beautiful long eyelashes were seen on the clear tint of her oval cheek. She was thinking of something else. Molly was trying to understand with all her might. Suddenly Cynthia looked up and caught Roger's gaze of intent admiration, too fully for her to be unaware that he was staring at her. She coloured a little, But after the first moment of rosy confusion at his evident admiration of her, she flew to the attack, diverting his confusion at thus being caught, to the defence of himself from her accusation. "It is quite true," she said to him. "I was not attending. You see, I don't even know the ABC of science. But please don't look so severely at me, even if I am a dunce." I didn't mean to look severely, I'm sure," replied Roger, not knowing well what to say. "Cynthia is not a dunce either," said Mrs. Gibson, afraid lest her daughter's opinion of herself might be taken seriously. "But I have always observed that some people have a talent for one thing, and some for another. Now Cynthia's talents are not for science and the severer studies. Do you remember, love, what trouble I had to teach you the use of the globes? Yes, and I don't know longitude from latitude now, and I'm always puzzled as to which is perpendicular and which is horizontal. Yet I do assure you," her mother continued, rather addressing herself to Osborne, "that her memory for poetry is prodigious. I have heard her repeat The Prisoner of Chillon from beginning to end." "It would be rather a bore to hear her, I think," said Mr. Gibson, smiling at Cynthia, who gave him back one of her bright looks of mutual understanding. "Oh, Mr. Gibson, I have found out before now that you have no soul for poetry, and Molly there is your own child. She reads such deep books, all about facts and figures. She'll be quite a blue-stocking by and by." "Mamma," said Molly, reddening, "you think it was a deep book because there were the shapes of the different cells of bees in it, but it was not at all deep. It was very interesting." "Never mind, Molly," said Osborne. "I stand up for blue-stockings." "And I object to the distinction implied in what you say," said Roger. "It was not deep, ergo it was interesting. Now, a book may be both deep and interesting." "Oh, if you're going to chop logic and use Latin words, I think it is time for us to leave the room," said Mrs. Gibson. "Don't let us run away as if we were beaten, mamma," said Cynthia. "Though it may be logic, I, for one, can understand what Mr. Roger Hamley said just now, and I read some of Molly's book, and whether it was deep or not, I found it very interesting. More so than I should think The Prisoner of Chillon nowadays. I've displaced The Prisoner to make room for Johnny Gilpin as my favourite poem." "How could you talk such nonsense, Cynthia?" said Mrs. Gibson, as the girls followed her upstairs. "You know you're not a dunce. It is all very well not to be a blue-stocking, because gentle people don't like that kind of woman. But running yourself down, and contradicting all I said about your liking for Byron and poets and poetry, to Mr. Osborne Hamley of all men, too." Mrs. Gibson spoke quite crossly for her. "But, mamma," Cynthia replied, "I am either a dunce or I am not. If I am, I did right to own it, and if I am not, he's a dunce if he doesn't find out I was joking." "Well," said Mrs. Gibson, a little puzzled by this speech, and wanting some elucidatory addition, "only that if he's a dunce, his opinion of me is worth nothing, so anyway it doesn't signify." "You really bewilder me with your nonsense, child. Molly is worth 20 of you." "I quite agree with you, mamma," said Cynthia, turning round to take Molly's hand. "Yes, but she ought not to be," said Mrs. Gibson, still irritated. "Think of the advantages you've had." "I'm afraid I'd rather be a dunce than a blue-stocking," said Molly, for the term had a little annoyed her, and the annoyance was rankling still. "Hush, here they are coming. I hear the dining-room door. I never meant you were a blue-stocking, dear, so don't look so vexed. Cynthia, my love, where did you get those lovely flowers? Anemones, are they? They suit your complexion so exactly." "Come, Molly, don't look so grave and thoughtful," exclaimed Cynthia. "Don't you perceive mamma wants us to be smiling and amiable?" Mr. Gibson had had to go out to his evening round, and the young men were all too glad to come up to the pretty drawing-room. The bright little wood fire, the comfortable easy-chairs which, with so small a party, might be drawn round the hearth, the good-natured hostess, the pretty, agreeable girls. Roger sauntered up to the corner where Cynthia was standing, playing with a hand-screen. "There is a charity ball in Hollingford soon, isn't there?" asked he. "Yes, on Easter Tuesday," she replied. "And are you going? I suppose you are." "Yes, mamma is going to take Molly and me." You will enjoy it very much. Going together. For the first time during this little conversation she glanced up at him, real honest pleasure shining out of her eyes. Yes, going together will make the enjoyment of the thing. It would be dull without her. You are great friends, then? He asked. I never thought I should like anyone so much. Any girl, I mean. She put in the final reservation in all simplicity of heart, and in all simplicity did he understand it. He came ever so little nearer, and dropped his voice a little. I was so anxious to know. I am so glad. I have often wondered how the two of you were getting on. Have you? Said she, looking up again. At Cambridge you must be very fond of Molly. Yes, I am. She was with us so long, and at such a time. I look upon her almost as a sister. And she is very fond of all of you. I seem to know you all, from hearing her talk about you so much. All of you, she said, laying an emphasis on all, to show that it included the dead as well as the living. Roger was silent for a minute or two. I didn't know you even by hearsay, so you mustn't wonder that I was a little afraid. But as soon as I saw you I knew how it must be, and it was such a relief. Cynthia, said Mrs. Gibson, who thought that the younger son had had quite his share of low, confidential conversation, come here and sing that little French ballad to Mr. Osborne Hamley. Which do you mean, mamma? Tout en répondra collant? Yes, such a pretty, playful little warning to young men, said Mrs. Gibson, smiling at Osborne. The refrain is, Tout en répondra collant, tout en répondra, car si tu prends une femme collant, tout en répondra. The advice may apply very well when there is a French wife in the case, but not, I am sure, to an Englishman who is thinking of an English wife. This choice of song was exceedingly mal apropos, had Mrs. Gibson but known it. Osborne and Roger, knowing that the wife of the former was a Frenchwoman, and conscious of each other's knowledge, felt doubly awkward, while Molly was as much confused as though she herself were secretly married. However, Cynthia carolled the saucy ditty out, and her mother smiled at it in total ignorance of any application it might have. Osborne had instinctively gone to stand behind Cynthia, as she sat at the piano, so as to be ready to turn over the leaves of her music if she required it. He kept his hands in his pockets, and his eyes fixed on her fingers, his countenance clouded with gravity at all the merry quips which she so playfully sang. Roger looked grave as well, but was much more at his ease than his brother. Indeed, he was half amused by the awkwardness of the situation. He caught Molly's troubled eyes and heightened colour, and he saw that she was feeling this contretemps more seriously than she needed to do. He moved to a seat by her and half whispered, "Too late a warning, is it not?" Molly looked up at him as he leant towards her and replied in the same tone, "Oh, I am so sorry." "You need not be. He won't mind it long, and a man must take the consequences when he puts himself in a false position." Molly could not tell what to reply to this, so she hung her head and kept silence. Yet she could see that Roger did not change his attitude, or remove his hand from the back of his chair, and impelled by curiosity to find out the cause of his stillness, she looked up at him, at length, and saw his gaze fixed on the two who were near the piano. Osborne was saying something eagerly to Cynthia, whose grave eyes were upturned to him with soft intentness of expression, and her pretty mouth half open, with a sort of impatience for him to cease speaking, that she might reply. "They are talking about France," said Roger, in answer to Molly's unspoken question. "Osborne knows it well, and Miss Kirkpatrick has been at school there, you know. It sounds very interesting. Shall we go nearer and hear what they're saying?" It was all very well to ask this civilly, but Molly thought it would have been better to wait for her answer. Instead of waiting, however, Roger went to the piano, and, leaning on it, appeared to join in a light, merry talk, while he feasted his eyes as much as he dared by looking at Cynthia. Molly suddenly felt as if she could scarcely keep from crying, A minute ago he had been so near to her, and talking so pleasantly and confidentially, and now he almost seemed as if he had forgotten her existence. She thought that this was all wrong, and she exaggerated its wrongness to herself. Mean and envious of Cynthia and ill-natured and selfish were the terms she kept applying to herself, but it did no good. She was just as naughty at the last as at the first. Mrs. Gibson broke into the state of things which Molly thought was to endure forever. Her stitch-work had been intricate up to this time, and had required a great deal of counting, so she had had no time to attend to her duties, one of which she always took to be to show herself to the world as an impartial stepmother. Cynthia had played and sung, and now she must give Molly her turn of exhibition. Cynthia's singing and playing was light and graceful, but anything but correct. But she herself was so charming that it was only fanatics of music who cared for false chords and omitted notes. Molly, on the contrary, had an excellent ear, if she had ever been well taught, and both from inclination and conscientious perseverance of disposition she would go over an incorrect passage for 20 times. But she was very shy of playing in company, and when forced to do it she went through her performance heavily, and hated her handiwork more than anyone. "Now you must play a little, Molly," said Mrs. Gibson. "Play us that beautiful piece of Kalkbrenner's, my dear." Molly looked up at her stepmother with beseeching eyes, but it only brought out another form of request, still more like a command. "Go at once, my dear. You may not play it quite rightly, and I know you are very nervous, but you are quite amongst friends." So there was a disturbance made in the little group at the piano, and Molly sat down to her martyrdom. "Please go away," she said to Osborne, who was standing behind her ready to turn over. "I can quite well do it for myself, and oh, if you would but talk." Osborne remained where he was in spite of her appeal, and gave her what little approval she got, for Mrs. Gibson, exhausted by her previous labour of counting her stitches, fell asleep in her comfortable sofa corner near the fire, and Roger, who began at first to talk a little in compliance with Molly's request, found his conversation with Cynthia so agreeable that Molly lost her place several times in trying to catch a sudden glimpse of Cynthia sitting at her work, and Roger by her, intent on catching her low replies to what he was saying. "There, now I've done," said Molly, standing up quickly as soon as she had finished the 18 dreary pages, "and I think I will never sit down to play again." Osborne laughed at her vehemence. Cynthia began to take some part in what was being said, and thus made the conversation general. Mrs. Gibson wakened up gracefully, as was her way of doing all things, and slid into the subjects they were talking about so easily that she almost succeeded in making them believe she had never been asleep at all. End of chapter 24.